Mama told me not to leave her side, the boy said. But she'd been cold for 2 days. The blasted canyonlands stretched on forever, a desolate stage that reeked of loneliness, indifference, and a violence that simmered just beneath the baked earth. Boaz Calder cared for none of it. His focus was the trail, the fresh tracks of a 2-bit bank robber, promising a pouch of coins. He was a man of real grit, his heart as hard and unforgiving as the terrain itself. Nothing broke his concentration, nothing, until the sound. It wasn't the wind nor the scuttling of a lizard. It was a child's whisper, a fragile melody in a land that only understood the dirge of death. Drawn by a force he hadn't felt in years, he found the boy. The child Finn sat beside a small mound, covered by a blanket, his innocent eyes fixed on Boaz. He wasn't crying, he was waiting. And then he spoke the words that would shatter Boaz Calder's world and unearth the one ghost he could never outrun. "Is Mama done resting yet?" he asked. "She told me not to leave her side." The heat was a physical weight pressing down from a brass blue sky that offered no mercy. It baked the malice into the land, a desolate stage that reeked of loneliness, indifference, and a violence that simmered just beneath the earth's cracked skin. The air tasted of grit and forgotten prayers. Boaz Calder cared for none of it. His world had been whittled down to the tracks in the dust before him, the clumsy trail of a 2-bit bank robber whose luck was about to run out. The bounty was meager, but the pursuit was a ritual, a familiar rhythm that kept the ghosts in his own mind quiet. He was a man of real grit, his heart a calloused knot, his eyes mirrors of the unforgiving landscape. Nothing broke his concentration, nothing, until the sound. It was not the wind's mournful song through the canyons, nor the scuttling of a lizard over hot stone. It was a whisper, a thread of sound so fragile it should have been torn apart by the vast, empty silence. A child's voice. It snagged something deep inside Boaz, an old wire, long dormant, that twitched with a forgotten instinct. He pulled on the reins of his horse, his head cocked, the hard lines of his face tightening. He dismounted his boots, sinking into the fine red dust, and moved toward the sound, his hand resting on the worn leather of his colt. He found him by the sluggish creek, a sliver of life in a world of decay. The boy couldn't have been more than 5, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and bones that looked as fragile as a bird's. He sat beside a small mound, covered by a dusty wool blanket, his small back straight, his attention fixed. He was talking to it. "I'm getting thirsty, Mama," the boy whispered to the mound, "but I won't go to the water. I'll stay right here, just like you said." Boaz felt the air leave his lungs in a sharp, silent rush. He'd seen death in every form imaginable: gunshot, knife wound, sickness, and raw, bloody hatred. It never surprised him. But this was different. This was a profanity against the natural order of things. The boy looked up, then his eyes, a startling clear blue. He showed no fear, only a child's simple curiosity. "Is Mama done resting yet?" he asked, his voice clear as a mission bell. "She told me not to leave her side." The world narrowed to the space between Boaz and the boy. The bounty, the tracks, the sun beating on his neck, it all dissolved. An old familiar ache settled in his gut, the echo of a failure he could never outrun. He took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound. "What's your name, kid?" Boaz's voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse. "Finian," the boy said. "Mama calls me Finn." Boaz knelt, his joints cracking in protest. His gaze fell upon the still form beneath the blanket. There was no rise and fall of breath. He knew, but he had to see. He reached out a hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second, before gently lifting a corner of the wool. Her face was peaceful, beautiful, even in the stark, unforgiving light. Thalia Wren. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged with blue. Around her throat, a dark, ugly bruise bloomed like a poisoned flower. His eyes swept the ground, and then he saw it. The boot print, deep, clear, with a distinctive nick in the heel. His blood turned to ice. Deke Moreland. The name was a curse in his mind, a brand of his own past shame, a ghost he'd failed to lay to rest. Clutched in the woman's cold hand was a crumpled piece of paper. Boaz carefully worked it free from her stiff fingers. It was an unfinished letter, her script elegant but frantic. "If anyone finds Finn, please tell him I never wanted to leave. Tell him his father." The letter ended there. "Mister, is she waking up now?" Finn's voice pulled Boaz from the abyss. Boaz looked from the dead woman to the living child, from the boot print of his nemesis to the plea in the unfinished letter. The weight of it all settled on his shoulders, heavier than any bounty. He could ride away. He could leave the boy report the body and let the wilderness claim another tragedy. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But he saw Moreland's boot print, and he knew this was no longer a choice. It was a reckoning. He folded the letter with deliberate care and tucked it into his coat. He stood a grim, towering shadow over the boy. "She's resting deep, kid," Boaz said the lie, tasting like ash in his mouth. "The sun's too hot for her out here. We need to find a warmer place, a safer place, to wait." He reached down his hand, hovering in the air, between them, an offering he wasn't sure the boy would take, or that he himself was worthy to give. The first act of a promise is the hardest. For Boaz Calder, it was the act of building a grave. He could not dig into the baked, unforgiving earth, so he gathered stones, his movements methodical, his face a mask of stone itself. Each rock he lifted felt heavier than the last, a penance for a sin he was only just beginning to understand. He worked under the silent, questioning gaze of the boy. Finn did not cry. He watched with a solemn stillness that was far more unnerving. "Are you hiding, Mama?" Mr. Finn asked, his small voice swallowed by the vastness. "So she can have a good long rest." Boaz paused, a heavy granite stone in his hands. He looked at the boy, at the impossible innocence in his eyes, and the lie caught in his throat like a shard of glass. "Something like that, kid," he rasped, placing the final stone upon the cairn. A bleak, lonely monument against a horizon that promised nothing. As he stood, his boot scuffed the dirt near Deke Moreland's track. A glint of metal nearly swallowed by the red dust. He bent, plucked it from the earth, and slid it into his pocket without a glance. There was no time. He had to get the boy away from this place of ghosts. Their first night together was a study in silence. The fire crackled a lone fist of warmth against a tidal wave of darkness. The stars, cold and distant, watched without judgment. Boaz, a man who could survive for weeks on jerky and grit, found himself utterly useless in the face of a child's hunger. He burned the bacon, and the beans turned to a black mush. Finn poked at the grim offering with a stick. "It's a bit crunchy. Eat it or don't." Boaz grunted, turning his attention to the fire, his embarrassment a hot coal in his gut. They sat in the thick silence for a long while, the universe stretching out around their small, flickering world. "My mama sang songs," Finn said suddenly, his voice soft. "She sang about the stars." "Do you know any songs, mister?" The question ambushed Boaz. Songs were a foreign language from a life he'd never lived. They were for men with homes, with wives, with sons they tucked into bed. Not for men like him. "No, kid," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "I don't know any songs." Later, when Finn was asleep, a small breathing mound, wrapped in Boaz's only good bedroll, the memories came. The firelight flickered, and in the dancing shadows, Boaz saw the ghost he was truly chasing. He saw the burning trading post from 5 years ago. He smelled the cloying mix of lamp oil and fear. He heard the screams, and he saw Deke Moreland's face illuminated by the flames, a mocking, triumphant smile just before he vanished into the smoke, leaving Boaz with nothing but ashes and a promise he had failed to keep to another family. Not again, he thought, his hand clenching into a fist. Not this time. Not this boy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the metal object he'd found. It wasn't a button. It was a cufflink elegantly carved with a strange crest, a serpent coiled around a banker's scale. It was the kind of thing a man wore in a San Francisco parlor, Not in this god-forsaken dust bowl. It was not something a lowlife like Deke Moreland would own. So why was it here? The days that followed fell into a strange new rhythm. The land remained a harsh enemy, but Finn began to see it as a world of wonders. He'd point to a hawk circling on a thermal, his small finger a stark contrast to Boaz's hand resting on his gun. He'd trace the shape of a sleeping giant in the distant mesas. He was forcing Boaz to look up from the trail to see the world he had long since chosen to ignore. One afternoon, Finn, scrambling over a rock, slipped and cut his hand. He didn't cry out, just bit his lip, trying to hide the welling blood. But Boaz saw it. He stopped, and for a moment a flicker of irritation crossed his face. Another delay. Then it vanished, replaced by something else. He knelt, tore a clean strip from the bottom of his own shirt, and wordlessly took the boy's small hand. His touch accustomed to the cold steel of a trigger, and the rough hemp of a rope was clumsy. He fumbled with the knot. "Mama used to kiss it better," Finn whispered, watching him. Boaz didn't look up. He just pulled the knot tight. "This'll hold," he grumbled. "Now, walk careful." He found Deke's trail again that evening. It was different now, arrogant. A set of hoof prints too clear to be accidental leading them west. And next to the tracks, half crushed into the dirt, was the stub of a cigar. Expensive. The kind Boaz had only ever smelled in the offices of powerful, corrupt men. It smelled of money and secrets, and it matched the impossible elegance of the cufflink in his pocket. Boaz stood looking toward the blood-red sunset. A cold certainty washed over him. Deke Moreland wasn't just running, he was leading. The trail wasn't a path to a fugitive, it was an invitation. But an invitation to what, and who else was waiting at the end of it? The town was named Redemption, a name so steeped in irony it was almost a joke. There was no redemption here, only dust, decay, and the ghosts of failed hopes. The clapboard buildings sagged their windows like vacant eyes, staring into nothing. A tinny piano, missing half its keys, plinked a mournful tune from a saloon that smelled of sour beer and desperation. This wasn't a town, it was a wound on the face of the earth, festering under the sun. Boaz felt the sickness of the place in his bones. It was a town built on secrets where men came to lose themselves and bury their sins. Finn, sensing the oppressive atmosphere, pressed closer to Boaz's leg as they walked his horse toward the livery, his small hand gripping the coarse fabric of Boaz's trousers. The boy was a small, bright candle in a suffocating dark, and Boaz felt an unfamiliar, fierce urge to shield his flame. He left Finn with the horse under the watchful eye of a stable boy, too young to be corrupted, and pushed his way into the saloon. The music stopped. Every eye turned to him, then quickly darted away. It was the kind of silence he knew well, the silence of fear. "I'm looking for a man," Boaz said, his voice cutting through the stale air. "Goes by Deke Moreland. Passed through here a day or two ago. The bartender a man with a face like a slab of raw meat, just polished a dirty glass. Ain't seen him. A lie." It was thick and oily in the air between them. Boaz let his gaze drift over the room, meeting the eyes of each patron for a second before they flinched away. He was with another man, a fella in a city suit. They were in a hurry. More silence. These men were terrified. Deke Moreland's shadow fell long and dark over this town. Boaz knew threats would be useless. He needed a different key. He re-examined the crumpled letter from Thalia's hand, his thumb tracing the faint, desperate script. Her words were a puzzle. The smith's promise broken. The wheel failed. The smith's promise. The blacksmith's forge was at the edge of town, a place of fire and force amidst the decay. The smith himself was a mountain of a man, his arms thick as tree trunks, his face grimed with sweat and soot. He hammered a glowing horseshoe on his anvil, the rhythmic clang a defiant heartbeat in the dying town. "I'm looking for Deke Moreland," Boaz said over the ringing of the hammer. The blacksmith didn't stop. "Don't know the name." Clang. Another lie. Boaz stepped closer, the heat from the forge washing over him. He pulled the ornate cufflink from his pocket and held it out on his open palm. A man of wealth and secrets passed through here. He was with Moreland. He lost this. The hammer faltered. The blacksmith stared at the cufflink, and for the first time Boaz saw the fear in his eyes. Trouble has a way of spreading, Boaz continued, his voice low and even. It's like a sickness, and I see this town is already sick. He glanced back toward the street where Finn was visible, kicking a stone near the stable. I'm not just hunting a man. I'm keeping a promise to a dead woman, a promise about her son. The smith's shoulders slumped. He set his hammer down with a heavy thud. He was here. He admitted, his voice a low rumble of defeat. Moreland. He was with a city man, just like you said. A slick fella. Looked important. He wiped a hand across his brow. I fixed a broken axle on their wagon. They were headed for the Wolf's Maw Pass. It's a bad place, mister. An ambush waiting to happen. What was their business? Boaz pressed. The blacksmith hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. It was strange. The city fella, he wasn't paying Deke. It was the other way around. Deke gave him a heavy leather satchel. It looked like he was paying tribute, not making a deal. Deke Moreland, a predator in his own right, was paying tribute to someone else. The thought sent a chill down Boaz's spine. This was bigger than he imagined. He thanked the smith and turned to leave, but his instincts screamed. The street had gone quiet, too quiet. The out-of-tune piano had stopped. He knew with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty that his conversation had been watched. His first thought was for the boy. He sprinted to the livery stable, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Finn. The stable was silent. Boaz found the stable boy in a corner, a fresh lump on his head, and Finn was gone. But before despair could take hold, he heard a tiny rustle from the hayloft above. He scrambled up the ladder. Finn was there, huddled behind a stack of hay, his eyes wide with terror. He had seen the men coming and hidden himself. Smart boy, Boaz breathed a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He grabbed Finn, his grip tight. Stay here. Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear. You understand me, Finn? No matter what. The boy nodded, trembling. Boaz pulled a dusty tarp over him and descended the ladder, just as three shadows detached themselves from the stalls. Calder, the leader, sneered. Deke said you'd be clumsy. Said the boy would soften you up. A gun barked. Wood splintered by Boaz's head. He dove behind a trough, his Colt already in his hand. The stable erupted into a maelstrom of gunfire, the terrified whinnies of horses, and the splintering of wood. Boaz was not a duelist. He was a survivor. He fought with vicious, calculated efficiency. He kicked over a lantern, plunging one side of the stable into smoky darkness. He fired through the gaps in the stalls, using the panicked horses as cover. He shot one man through the chest. The second caught a bullet in the leg and went down screaming. The third, the leader, was smarter. He flanked Boaz, appearing from the shadows as Boaz reloaded. The world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain as a bullet tore through the flesh of his side. He staggered, a raw grunt escaping his lips. The man lunged, his knife glinting. Boaz, fueled by a desperate primal rage, brought his pistol up and fired from the hip. The close-range blast threw the man backward into a pile of hay, his eyes wide with surprise. Silence descended, broken only by the drip of his own blood, onto the dusty floor. The pain in his side was a hot, insistent fire, but it was nothing compared to the cold dread that gripped him. He pushed himself up, leaning against a post, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finn, he called out, his voice hoarse. For a terrible second there was no answer. Then a small, pale face peered down from the loft. Finn was safe. He had obeyed. He was staring at the blood soaking Boaz's shirt. He didn't ask about the gunshots or the men lying still in the shadows. He asked a different question, his small voice cutting through the haze of Boaz's pain. Are you okay? Looking at the boy, Boaz felt the purpose of his life snap into sharp, brutal focus. This wasn't about Deke anymore. It wasn't about his own past. It was about this child's future. He checked the pockets of the dead leader. He didn't find a pouch of coins. He found a small folded map of the Wolf's Maw Pass. A single crude cross marked a narrow choke point. It wasn't a warning, it was a destination. He was being herded a steer, guided to the slaughterhouse. But why, what in God's name was waiting for them in the Wolf's Maw? The livery stable reeked of blood hay and burnt lamp oil. Boaz gritted his teeth as he pressed a strip of cloth torn from a saddle blanket against the seeping wound in his side. The bullet had ripped through the flesh a hot, angry furrow that promised fever if he didn't keep it clean. Across the stall, Finn watched him, his small face pale in the dusty shafts of morning light, his eyes wide and dark. He didn't speak, but his silence was a heavy thing, filled with a question Boaz could not answer. "It's just a scratch, kid," Boaz lied, his voice a low grunt of pain. "Had worse from shaving." Finn's gaze dropped. "Mama had a scratch too," he whispered to the floor. "On her neck." The words hit Boaz harder than the bullet had. He stopped his clumsy bandaging, the world narrowing to the memory of the bruise on Thalia's throat. A scratch. A child's word for an act of monstrous violence. The rage that followed was cold and clean. It burned away the pain. His work here was not done. He retrieved the crumpled letter from his coat pocket, smoothing it out on a dusty barrelhead. The cufflink and the map from the dead man's pocket lay beside it. His eyes, accustomed to seeking patterns in the dust, now sought a pattern in the ink. The words were a dead end, but the numbers Thalia had scrawled at the bottom pulsed with a silent meaning he had previously ignored. 18/7/32. Not a date, not a sum, a code, a key to what they left redemption at dawn, the town's fearful silence a shroud at their backs. The open plains gave way to a harsher country, a land of jagged rock and shadow-choked canyons that clawed at the sky. They were entering the territory of the wolf. The air grew colder, the trail narrower. Boaz could feel it in his gut, a tightening, a sense of unseen eyes, watching from the high ridges. This was no longer a pursuit. It was a pilgrimage into the heart of a trap. Halfway through the first canyon they saw it. Pinned to the bleached white trunk of a dead sycamore tree was a small, crudely carved wooden bird. A wren. Its wings were broken. Boaz's hand went to his gun. He approached the tree alone, his steps slow and deliberate. Below the bird, a message had been seared into the bark with a hot knife. She sang a pretty song, Calder. The little bird sings too. Bring the cufflink to the pass, or I'll cage him for good. Deke Moreland knew. He knew about the cufflink, which meant his meeting with the man in the city suit had been recent. He knew Finn's name. This wasn't a taunt. It was a summons, a demand for tribute. Boaz ripped the wooden bird from the tree, the splintered wood digging into his palm. He was being stripped of his role as the hunter piece by piece and recast as the pawn. That night they camped in a shallow cave, a dark mouth in the rock face that offered little comfort. The entrance to the Wolf's Maw loomed before them, a place of ill omen. The wind that whipped through the pass carried no songs, only a low, hungry moan. Boaz cleaned his Colt, the familiar methodical clicks of the cylinder, a small prayer against the encroaching darkness. He thought Finn was asleep until a sharp, terrified cry tore through the quiet. "No, don't let him take her." Mama Boaz froze. Finn was thrashing in the bedroll, his face slick with sweat in the firelight, his hands batting at unseen monsters. The Shadow Man. He's hurting Mama. Every instinct screamed at Boaz to stay back, to let the nightmare run its course. He was a dealer in violence, not in comfort. But he saw the raw terror on the boy's face, and he could not turn away. He moved to the bedroll, kneeling beside the trembling child. He felt a mountain of uselessness. What could he say? The truth was a monster far worse than any dream. "It's all right, kid," he mumbled the words, feeling clumsy and hollow. "Just a bad dream." Finn's eyes flew open, slick with tears. He had no face. Desperate Boaz did the one thing he could think of. He put a heavy, awkward hand on the boy's shoulder. He began to speak, his voice a low rumble, telling a story he was inventing as he went. A story about a great gray hawk who lived alone on a high cliff, and about a small wren who had lost its nest. About how the hawk, who had never cared for anything but the wind, found the small bird and fought off a coiled serpent to keep it safe. The story was simple, foolish even, but he kept talking, his voice a steady anchor in the boy's sea of fear. Slowly the trembling subsided. Finn's breathing evened out. He drifted back to sleep, his small hand clutching a fistful of Boaz's worn coat. Boaz sat there for a long time, his hand still on the boy's shoulder. The fire in his gut had changed. The hot, vengeful need to put Deke Moreland in the ground was still there, but it was now banked by a different, fiercer flame. A white-hot, protective inferno. He would not just kill Deke, he would erase him. He would burn his memory from the face of the earth to ensure he could never cast a shadow on this boy's life again. As the first light of dawn touched the cruel spires of the wolf's maw, Boaz looked down at the map from the dead man's pocket. He had been staring at the cross, the ambush point, but he hadn't truly seen the map. Faint lines, almost invisible, detailed an old, abandoned silver mine. The cross wasn't just in the pass, it was directly over a marking that read, Shaft 18. His eyes darted to the numbers Thalia had written, 18-7-32, Shaft 18, Level 7, Lockbox 32. It wasn't a code, it was a location, the proof the ledger was hidden there. Deke wasn't just leading him into a trap, he was leading him directly to the evidence that could destroy him and his powerful unseen partners. The question hammered in Boaz's mind, colder and sharper than the dawn wind. Why would any man lead his enemy straight to the keys of his own damnation? The world had shrunk, its vast, indifferent horizons collapsing into a single narrow path. The trail to the wolf's maw. Every step Boaz and Finn took was a step deeper into the throat of the beast, the jagged canyon walls rising around them like broken teeth. The wind funneled through the tight passages, whispered of ancient hungers and bad ends. Boaz felt the weight of the map in his pocket, the X a damning premonition. He was walking into a trap, and he was leading a child by the hand. The thought was a constant low-grade fever in his blood. He couldn't take him in there. The realization was as stark and solid as the rock formations looming over them. To bring Finn into a place marked for his own execution was not just foolish. It was a betrayal of the vow he'd made over Thalia's makeshift grave. He needed a sanctuary, a temporary harbor in a world of wolves. His mind, a dusty archive of trails and forgotten places, settled on one. The mission of San Geronimo, a small sun-bleached adobe church and cloister nestled in a hidden valley, 2 days' ride off the main trail. It was run by a man Boaz hadn't seen in 20 years, a man who had traded a bottle for a Bible, a priest named Father Michael. He was the only man Boaz could think of who might still believe in the currency of grace. The ride was a detour into a softer land. The harsh angles of the canyons gave way to rolling hills, dotted with juniper and sage. The mission, when it appeared, was like a mirage of peace. Its adobe walls glowed gold in the late afternoon sun, a simple wooden cross reaching toward the heavens. A small, well-tended garden bloomed with impossible life in the arid soil. It was a place of quiet, a place of order. Father Michael was older, his face a roadmap of hard-won serenity, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. They held a flicker of recognition as Boaz dismounted. Calder the priest said, his voice a low, calm rumble. "I thought the desert had swallowed you whole years ago." "It tried," Father Boaz replied, his own voice sounding rough and out of place in the tranquil courtyard. "I need a favor, a great one." He gestured to Finn, who was hiding behind his leg, peering out at the robed stranger, the boy. "He needs a safe place, just for a day or two. His kin are waiting for him, but I have some business to settle first. Dangerous business." The lie felt clumsy on his tongue, a poorly crafted thing of sharp edges and hollow spaces. Father Michael's gaze shifted from Boaz's hard face to Finn's wide, fearful eyes. The old priest saw the lie Boaz knew he did, but he also saw the desperation behind it. He saw the truth that mattered. "The house of God is always open to a child in need," the priest said, his voice gentle. He knelt, his robes pooling in the dust, and spoke to Finn. "You will be safe here, little one. We have warm bread and a goat who loves to have his ears scratched." The farewell was an amputation. Finn, who had been a constant small presence at Boaz's side, for days now clung to him, his small hands bunched in his duster. "You're coming back," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You promised." Boaz's throat closed. He had made no such promise aloud, but he knew he had made it in every action, every shared meal, every moment he had stood between the boy and the world's harshness. He knelt, forcing himself to meet Finn's gaze. "I will come back for you," he said, and the words were an oath heavier than any stone he'd ever lifted. "I swear it, on your mother's memory." He pressed the small, broken wooden wren into Finn's hand, closing the boy's fingers around it. "You hold on to this for me." He turned and walked away without looking back, the sound of Finn's small, confused sob, a knife in his back. He mounted his horse shade and rode away from the only island of peace he had found, heading back toward the maw. Leaving the boy, he told himself, was the only way to save him. But it felt like the greatest failure of all. The wolf's maw was a place where the sun died first. As Boaz entered the pass, the light grew thin and gray, and the temperature dropped. The towering rock walls pressed in, creating a suffocating sense of enclosure. The wind howled a mad, lonely tune. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every loose stone a potential trigger for an ambush. His senses were stretched taut, every nerve screaming. He was a living tripwire. He followed the map, his eyes scanning the high ground, his colt a heavy, comforting weight in his hand. He saw signs of their passage, a recently disturbed patch of ground, the ashes of a small fire. They had been here. They had waited. But they were gone now. He was alone. He found the entrance to shaft Measure 18, hidden behind a curtain of scree and dead brush. It was a black, gaping hole in the mountainside, exhaling a breath of cold, damp air that smelled of wet earth and ancient decay. He lit a lantern. The flame flickered a fragile defiance against the overwhelming darkness. He stepped inside. The world above vanished. He was in the belly of the earth. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water, echoing in the distance, and the scuttling of unseen things just beyond the reach of his light. The air was thick, hard to breathe. He moved deeper, his lantern, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on his eyes. He followed the main tunnel, his boots crunching on loose rock. He found the turnoff for level 7, a smaller, more unstable-looking passage, shored up with rotting timbers. He moved through it, his shoulders brushing the rough-hewn walls, and then he saw it. An old dynamite cache, a heavy iron lockbox bolted to the rock wall. The number 32 was painted on its lid in faded white paint. 18-7-32, Thalia's code. His heart hammered against his ribs. He used the butt of his pistol to smash the rusted lock. It groaned, then broke with a sharp crack that echoed down the tunnel. With a deep breath, he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry, rotting cloth, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. He grabbed it, his fingers trembling slightly. He flipped it open. The beam of his lantern fell upon neat columns of spidery script. Names, dates, locations, and payments. It was all there. A meticulous, horrifying record of Deke Moreland's business, a web of human misery that stretched from the Barbary coast to the high frontier. He saw the name of a prominent railroad magnate. He saw the name of a territorial judge. And he saw the name engraved on the cufflink. This ledger was a bomb that could shatter the foundations of power in the territory. Thalia Wren had died to protect this, but it wasn't the only thing in the box. Sitting right on top of the first page, stark white against the yellowed paper, was a folded note. It was fresh. The ink was barely dry. His blood ran cold. He picked it up. "You found the past, Calder, while I took the future. A fair trade, your move." The mine shaft seemed to contract around him, the air sucked from his lungs. The ledger, the map, the ambush that never came, it was all a lie. A perfectly choreographed piece of theater, designed for one purpose: to get him here. To get him deep underground, chasing ghosts while Deke's men moved on the true prize. The real trap hadn't been in the pass, it had been at the mission. The target was never him, it was always Finn. The ride back was a frantic, desperate blur. Boaz pushed Shade harder than he had ever pushed an animal, before the horse's great lungs, heaving its flanks lathered in sweat. The 2-day journey became a hellish, non-stop race against the clock. He did not eat. He did not rest. He was fueled by a self-loathing so profound, it felt like it could burn a hole through his soul. He had sworn an oath on a dead woman's memory, and he had broken it. He had left the boy. He had walked right into Deke's trap like a greenhorn fool. The thought was a repeating hammer blow against his skull. He left the boy. He left the boy. He saw the mission from a mile away, and the wrongness of it hit him like a physical blow. There was no smoke from the chimney. The gate was askew. A deathly quiet hung over the place. He slid from Shade's back before the horse had even stopped his boots, hitting the ground running. He found Father Michael in the chapel, slumped on a pew, his face a swollen, bruised mess. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle. The old priest was alive, but only just. The chapel had been desecrated, the pews overturned, the simple altar cloth torn and thrown to the floor. Father Boaz knelt, his voice a raw whisper. The priest's one good eye fluttered open. Calder, he rasped, his voice thick with pain. They came, after you left. They were not bandits. They were professionals. Boaz's gut twisted into a cold, hard knot. Finn. They posed as travelers, the priest continued, his breath shallow. Asked for water. I let them in. They waited. Then they struck. They were quiet, efficient. They knew who they were looking for. They took the boy. He coughed, a thin trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. I tried. I am an old man, Boaz. Did they say where they were going? Boaz asked, his voice tight with a terrifying calm. The leader, he was a cruel man, smiled while his men broke my arm. The priest winced, reaching with his good hand into his robe. Before he left, he looked at me. He said, "Tell Calder the caravan is open for business." He dropped this on the floor. He opened his hand. In his palm was a small, crudely minted brass coin. On one side was the image of a cage, on the other a deep canyon. It was a token for the Red Canyon Caravan, a notorious mobile slave market that roamed the lawless territories, a place whispered about in hushed, horrified tones, a place from which no one ever returned. The last of Boaz's carefully constructed control shattered. He gently tended to the priest's injuries, his hands moving with a strange precision, his mind a whirlwind of ice and fire. He helped him to his cell, gave him water, and barred the door from the outside to keep him safe. Then he walked back out into the desecrated courtyard. The grief, the guilt, the self-hatred, it all burned away, leaving behind something pure and terrible in its wake. A new vow, a final one, was forged in that moment. He would not just rescue Finn. He would not just kill Deke Moreland. He would become the fire that burned the Red Canyon Caravan from the face of the earth. He would become the righteous, cleansing storm. He strode to his horse, his movements no longer weary, but filled with a lethal, singular purpose. He checked the ledger, tucked it safely away. He checked his colt. He took the sticks of dynamite he kept for clearing rockfalls from his saddlebags. He was no longer a bounty hunter. He was no longer a man seeking redemption. He was an instrument of annihilation. He rode not toward a rescue, but toward a conflagration of his own making. He no longer cared if he survived it. He only cared that Deke Moreland and everyone like him burned. The Red Canyon Caravan was a festering wound disguised as a carnival. Gaudy tents bled garish light onto a squalid street of mud and despair, where the music of a mocking fiddle mingled with the rattling of chains. It was a market of human souls. Boaz moved through it like a phantom, a whisper of vengeance in the shadows. He planted his charges with the steady hand of a surgeon, his heart a cold, hard stone. Through the throng he saw him, Finn, trapped in an iron cage on display for a man with a serpent's smile and a fat purse. The boy was not crying. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching, hoping. Their gazes met across the sea of leering faces. That was the signal. Boaz triggered the first charge. An explosion ripped through a nearby wagon, not to kill, but to unleash chaos. Fire bloomed against the night sky. He fired his Colt not at men, but at the locks on the cages. The damned erupted from their prisons, a tide of rage and desperation that crashed over their captors. Amidst the inferno, Boaz cut a path to Deke Moreland, who was dragging Finn's cage toward the darkness. "You should have stayed buried," Calder Deke screamed over the roar. "You can't have him. He was never yours." Boaz said, his voice a low promise of damnation. Their final battle was not a duel. It was a reckoning fought in the swirling smoke and righteous fire. It ended as it had to, with Deke Moreland's evil silenced forever in the dust. He carried Finn away from the ruins of that hell, riding until dawn. They stopped at a small, sun-drenched farmstead, nestled in a green valley, a place that felt like a different world. A good woman with kind eyes came out to meet them. The ledger was sent. Justice was in motion. It was time. "You're leaving, Finn?" asked his small hand, clutching Boaz's duster. "I have to, kid. Will I see you again?" Boaz knelt. He looked into the boy's eyes, the eyes of the promise he had finally kept. He took the small broken wooden wren from his pocket, he'd mended it by the firelight, and pressed it into Finn's palm. "Your mother wanted you to be safe," Boaz said, his voice thick with a universe of unspoken words. "That's the only thing that ever mattered." He stood, turned, and walked to his horse without looking back. He rode not into a bloody sunset, but into the clean, quiet light of a new morning, a man who had paid the terrible price of his redemption and was at last at peace.